Welcome to today's episode of Studio Connections, where we explore the unexpected moments of human connection that happen when we sit down for deep, meaningful conversations. I'm your host, and today I want to share a particularly special episode that left me thinking about the nature of intimacy, voice, and the power of being present with another person. It's a story about a moment that might seem small on the surface, but opened up a much deeper conversation about how we connect with each other, especially in the context of gay romance and relationships. Before I dive into what happened, let me give you some background on why this particular episode meant so much to me. For the past 3 years, I've been interviewing writers, artists, and everyday people about their experiences with love, connection, and relationships. There's something magical about sitting across from someone and hearing their story directly from them. The way their eyes light up when they talk about their passions, the subtle shifts in their voice when they touch on something vulnerable. But as any podcaster knows, there's always this technical barrier between you and your guest: the microphones, the headphones, the awareness that you're on record. It creates a certain formality that can sometimes make it challenging to reach those moments of genuine connection. So, let me set the scene for you. My studio is nothing fancy, just a converted spare bedroom in my apartment with some sound-dampening panels on the walls, 2 comfortable chairs facing each other, and a small table between them for my recording equipment. I've tried to make it feel welcoming: warm lighting, a small plant in the corner, and a bookshelf filled with works from previous guests. It's intimate by necessity, but I've always felt that this intimacy serves the conversations well. There's nowhere to hide in a space like this, which often leads to more authentic exchanges. For this particular episode, my guest was Daniel, an author who had recently published a novel exploring the nuances of gay relationships in small-town America. I'd been following his work for years and was genuinely excited to have him on the show. Daniel's writing has this remarkable quality of making you feel like you're eavesdropping on real conversations between fully realized people. There's an authenticity to his dialogue that many writers strive for, but few achieve. I was curious about how he managed to capture the subtle dynamics of connection so effectively on the page. When Daniel arrived at the studio, I was immediately struck by his presence. He had this calm, centered energy about him, the kind that immediately puts you at ease. He was taller than I expected, with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled, which he did often. We spent a few minutes chatting informally as I set up the equipment, and I could already tell this was going to be a good conversation. There was an easy flow to our pre-show small talk, none of the awkwardness that sometimes precedes these recordings. I explained the technical setup as I always do, how the microphones work, the importance of maintaining a consistent distance, and of course, the necessity of wearing headphones throughout the recording. The headphones are crucial for guests to monitor their own volume and avoid talking over each other, but they also create a slight separation from the natural flow of conversation. It's a necessary evil in podcast production, one that both host and guest usually adjust to within the first few minutes. As we settled in and I started the recording, we began with the usual introductions and background questions. Daniel spoke about his childhood in rural Minnesota, his journey to becoming a writer, and the personal experiences that informed his latest novel. The conversation flowed naturally as we discussed the challenges of writing authentic dialogue, the responsibility of representing diverse gay experiences, and the universal aspects of human connection that transcend sexuality or gender. About 30 minutes into our conversation, we were deep into a discussion about vulnerability in relationships, both on and off the page. Daniel was making a point about how true intimacy requires dropping our performative selves and allowing another person to see us as we truly are. And then, without any warning or explanation, he reached up and removed his headphones, placing them gently on the table between us. I was momentarily thrown off, as any podcaster would be. My immediate concern was technical. Would he still be able to modulate his volume properly? Would this affect the recording quality? But before I could say anything, he smiled and said something that stopped me in my tracks. "I hope you don't mind, but I'd rather hear your voice directly. It sounds better up close, more real somehow." There was something so genuine in that moment, a small act of rebellion against the technical constraints we'd placed on our conversation. And strangely enough, the quality of our exchange immediately shifted. Without the slight delay and artificial sound of the headphones, our conversation became more natural, more present. I found myself leaning in slightly, paying closer attention to his expressions, matching my rhythm to his in a way that felt almost musical. Let me explain why this matters so much in the context of what we were discussing. In gay romance, as in all relationships, there's often this dance between presentation and authenticity. Many of us grow up learning to modulate ourselves, our voices, our mannerisms, our expressions of desire, to fit into spaces that might not fully accept us. We develop a kind of dual consciousness, always somewhat aware of how we're being perceived. Daniel's simple act of removing his headphones felt like a metaphor for shedding those layers of performance, choosing direct connection over technical perfection. As our conversation continued, we explored this idea more deeply. Daniel shared how, in his writing process, he often reads dialogue aloud to test its authenticity. There's something about the human voice that can't be faked, he explained. You can write the most beautiful words on the page, but if they don't sound natural when spoken aloud, they'll never truly connect with a reader. This led us into a fascinating discussion about the role of voice in intimacy. Think about it. The voice is this remarkable instrument that conveys not just our words, but our emotions, our histories, our desires. The slight tremor when we're nervous, the warmth that enters our tone when we speak about someone we love, the particular cadence that is uniquely ours. In romantic relationships, especially in their early stages, there's often this hunger to hear the other person's voice. It's why new couples can spend hours on the phone, why a partner's voice calling from another room can create an immediate sense of comfort. Daniel shared a story from his own life that illustrated this perfectly. He told me about his first serious relationship in college, with a young man who was studying music composition. He used to tell me that he fell in love with my voice before he fell in love with me, Daniel recalled with a smile. We met in a literature class where I read a poem aloud, and he said he found himself closing his eyes just to focus on the sound of my words. Later, when we were together, he would ask me to read to him almost every night, not because he couldn't read himself, but because he said my voice made the words mean more. There's something profoundly intimate about that kind of listening, isn't there? About being truly heard by another person. It's a form of attention that goes beyond just registering the content of what's being said to appreciating the unique instrument through which it's being expressed. This reminded me of my own experiences in relationships, particularly the early days of dating my ex-partner. We lived in different cities when we first met, about 3 hours apart by train. Our relationship developed largely through long phone calls, where all we had were our voices to connect us. I remember how different it felt to get to know someone primarily through sound, how it created a different kind of intimacy than the visually dominated connections we often form in person. By the time we finally arranged regular visits, I felt like I knew the landscape of his voice intimately, all its terrain and weather patterns. I could tell when he was smiling just from the subtle shift in his tone, could sense his thoughtfulness in the measured pauses between words. As Daniel and I continued our conversation in the studio, with his headphones still resting on the table between us, we discussed how this relates to writing gay romance specifically. There's often this assumption that physical attraction dominates romantic narratives, particularly queer ones. But the most compelling love stories, regardless of sexuality, usually involve this deeper recognition, one person truly hearing another, often for the first time. Daniel pointed out how, in his novel, he deliberately included scenes where his characters simply talk to each other, sometimes in the dark, sometimes while doing mundane activities, sometimes over distance. I wanted to show that falling in love isn't just about seeing someone and desiring them, he explained. It's about creating a space where both people can speak and be heard authentically. For many queer people, finding someone who truly listens to us, without judgment or preconception, can be revolutionary. This resonated deeply with me. In a world where gay men are often hypersexualized or reduced to stereotypes, there's something radical about depicting relationships that center on this kind of deep listening and recognition. It challenges the narrative that queer connections are somehow fundamentally different from other human bonds. The hunger to be heard, to be understood, to have our particular voice recognized and valued. These are universal desires that transcend sexuality or gender. As our conversation continued, I found myself sharing more personal stories than I typically would in an interview. There was something about the quality of attention Daniel was offering, fully present, without the slight barrier of the headphones, that invited a deeper level of disclosure. I told him about my first boyfriend, who had this habit of calling me just to hear my voice when he was having a bad day. "You don't even need to say anything important," he would tell me. "Just talk about your day or read me the newspaper. Your voice helps me feel grounded." At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant, but years later, I recognize it as one of the purest expressions of intimacy I've experienced. There's a special kind of love in wanting to hear someone's voice simply because it's theirs, in finding comfort in their particular way of expressing themselves. Daniel nodded in recognition. "That's exactly what I try to capture in my writing," he said. "Those moments where connection transcends content, where it's not about what's being said, but about who's saying it and who's listening." We talked about how this applies to podcasting as well. In an increasingly digital world, there's something almost rebellious about choosing to connect through voice alone. No visual filters, no carefully curated images, just the raw humanity of speech with all its imperfections and expressiveness. Perhaps this explains the incredible intimacy that can develop between podcast hosts and their regular listeners. This sense of being in direct, unmediated conversation. As we approach the end of our scheduled time, I realized that this had become one of the most genuine conversations I'd had on the show. By removing his headphones, that small barrier between us, Daniel had shifted the energy of our exchange in a subtle but significant way. We weren't just host and guest performing a podcast anymore. We were two people engaged in a real dialogue about the nature of human connection. Before we wrapped up, I asked Daniel if there was anything he wanted listeners to take away from our conversation. He thought for a moment, then smiled. "I guess I'd want them to remember that technology is wonderful. It allows us to connect across distances, to record conversations like this one and share them with others. But sometimes, the most profound connections happen when we're willing to remove some of those technological layers and just be present with each other. Whether that's taking off your headphones during a podcast recording or putting down your phone when you're with someone you care about." He paused, then added, "And I'd want them to pay attention to voices. Not just the words being said, but the actual sound of human speech, with all its beautiful imperfections and expressiveness. There's so much being communicated beyond the literal meaning of our words." As we ended the recording and I began packing up my equipment, I felt a sense of gratitude for what had just transpired. What could have been just another interview had transformed into something more meaningful through one simple, spontaneous gesture. It reminded me why I started this podcast in the first place, not just to collect and broadcast interesting conversations, but to create moments of genuine human connection. If you're listening to this now, I invite you to think about the voices in your own life that matter to you. The people whose particular way of speaking brings you comfort, joy, or a sense of being home. Perhaps it's a partner, a friend, a family member, or even a favorite podcast host. Consider what it means to truly listen to someone, not just to the content of their words, but to the unique instrument through which they express themselves. And if you're currently navigating the complex terrain of romance, gay, straight, or anywhere on the spectrum, remember that among the many forms of intimacy we seek, there is this profound one: to speak and be heard, to listen and truly understand. Sometimes the deepest connections form not in grand gestures or perfect moments, but in the simple act of removing our metaphorical headphones and choosing to experience each other directly, without filters or barriers. Thank you for listening to this episode of Studio Connections. If you enjoyed this conversation and reflection, please consider subscribing to the podcast and sharing it with others who might find value in these explorations of human connection. Until next time, keep listening not just to this show, but to the important voices in your own life. Sometimes the most beautiful sounds are the ones we hear when we're truly paying attention to each other. Total_char_count, 17,856.